This week we begin with the post-classic period. At this point, the Mayan people have scattered from their major population centers, and the city of Teotihuacan, one of the only sites in the classic period that wasn't Maya and a major trade center, had also been abandoned and may have even spurred the collapse of many of the Mayan centers. Enter the Aztec, or Nahua people, who moved south into present-day Mexico from what we consider the American Southwest. In their mythology, they had originally come from Mexico, and so this migration was actually a homecoming for them. The Aztec people and the 7 linguistic dialects of Nahuatl, the Aztec language, were said to emerge from a cave with 7 divisions in central Mexico, called the 7 Caves of Aztlan. On their trek back to their homeland, they received a vision of an eagle on a cactus as the sign that they had arrived, and, according to the legend, when they arrived close to the abandoned city of Teotihuacan, they saw this very sign, which you'll recognize from the flag of modern-day Mexico. So during the 1100s, the Aztec moved back into the lands they were perhaps originally from in present-day central Mexico. They arrive in the midst of a power gap. After the classic period, many groups were competing to take back the control and trade that the Mayan priests previously once had. Several Toltec factions began fighting to take control of the area and remake the classic period trade networks, leading to a rise in militarism and warfare. The site of Xochicalco was a Toltec center during this time, and it exhibits a temple platform, defensive walls, and depictions of fighting. The Toltecs fought from 900 to 1115 AD or CE before the Aztecs appeared. The Aztecs seem to have entered this scenario as assassins for hire initially, but as the kingdoms they worked for grew weaker, they seized the chance to take control. How did a minority take and maintain power over more populous groups like the Toltec and some Mayan groups? Firstly, the Aztec had set as their capital the abandoned city of Teotihuacan, renaming it Tenochtitlan. This city sat in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a lake that was later filled in. Mexico City today was built directly on top of Tenochtitlan and the filled-in Lake Texcoco, which is why earthquakes are so devastating there, since the ground essentially reliquefies during tremors. They also took the surrounding cities of Texcoco, named for the lake, and Tlacopan. These 3 cities taken by the Aztec and allied with each other formed what's called the Triple Alliance. All 3 were located around Lake Texcoco, which was covered in chinampas to support the 3 large cities' populations. In 100 to 150 years of living in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec population boomed from about 500,000 to approximately 3 million. They were still a minority in the area, but Tenochtitlan itself was the largest city in the world by 1500 AD or CE, and long before 1500 they could maintain an impressive professional standing army. Aztec culture was highly militaristic. Clubs with obsidian blades, which appeared during the late classic period, were made by the Aztec in higher numbers. The peoples who the Aztec once fought for and then conquered show evidence of being militarily dominated. Burned homes and temples abound. This is one of the 3 main ways that the Aztec maintained their power. The first was to divide and conquer small areas. The Aztec did not have a large enough population to attack all of their dominated regions at once, but they could go into one region and completely decimate it. Having been attacked by them, or seeing your neighboring group attacked by them, was often enough to put conquered people back in line. The Aztec also spread misinformation, making one group of conquered people think that their neighbor was planning to attack them, and basically sowing distrust among all these different Toltec and Mayan groups who, keep in mind, had been fighting each other when the Aztec arrived, so making them dislike each other was probably not too difficult to do initially. This leads us to the second way that the Aztec maintained their power, through the control of information. The Aztec employed merchants who were, in fact, spies, sent out throughout their kingdom to report on the territories and spread this misinformation. Now these spies, called Pochtecas, wore the same uniform, which we know because they were featured in the Florentine Codex. They were easy to spot, and people figured out quickly that they were spies, but even knowing that, you couldn't turn them away, because to anger the Aztec was to bring their army down on you, or have them up your taxes. Finally, the third way the Aztec maintained their power was to sacrifice members of the populations they conquered. Archaeologists are still arguing about Mayan human sacrifice, and if it was what we'd really call sacrifice, but the Aztec practice of human sacrifice is well supported by textual and archaeological evidence. At the bottom of Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor, which I discuss in a minute, pits containing massive amounts of human remains have been found. most with cuts on their rib cage that show no signs of healing, meaning they led to the victim's death. There are also the remnants of skull racks, which were used to display human skulls, and these are also depicted in Aztec literature. There's also the heart stone, a vessel to put removed hearts into, which we also see drawings of. Turning to the written evidence, the Aztec had a language quite different from the ancient Maya. Written Nahuatl prior to colonization was hieroglyphic and pictorial, but highly complicated to read because each symbol's meaning is changed by the symbols around it. We have 2 major Aztec codices today, though there were probably hundreds or even thousands more. Most were burned by the Spanish. The Codex Mendoza has a history section, a list of tributes that were sent in to the Aztec rulers, and accounts of daily life, which includes depictions of spectacles as entertaining as the ball game, similar to the Mayan ball game, to frightening depictions of human sacrifice on temple steps. From the Florentine Codex, we get some mythological accounts. One story focused on a goddess named Coyolxauhqui, whose brother, Huitzilopochtli, cut her into pieces and threw her from the summit of Coatepec Mountain. This story emerged again in 1978 when a large carving that seems to represent the story was discovered in an archaeological dig of what was Tenochtitlan's major temple. This temple, called the Templo Mayor, sits directly beneath Mexico City's first and largest Catholic church, likely an attempt by the Spanish to discourage indigenous religion and replace it, metaphorically and in physical form, with Christianity. Like the Mayan myths, many Aztec myths feature sacrifice in some form, but unlike the Mayan myths, dismemberment features as much or even more prominently than bloodletting. We also have Spanish accounts, such as the Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España by Sahagún, a priest traveling with Hernando Cortés. This account describes the step pyramid temples of the Aztec as having steps permanently colored red from the sheer number of sacrifice victims whose bodies were flung to the bottom of it after their hearts were removed. Of course, we have reason to be skeptical of all these historical sources. A culture writing about itself may omit things it dislikes or refuses to acknowledge. The Aztec, for example, as vulnerable as they were being a minority in power, may have been hesitant to reveal the number of uprisings they faced, though they document some. The Spanish had political interest in the land, and with it already having inhabitants, they had every reason to denigrate those inhabitants and therefore justify their brutal takeover. Whenever we read historical accounts, we should ask who is writing it, how they would have interpreted or misinterpreted the scene being described, what was normal or strange for them, and what their political interests might be. Still, even though Spanish accounts seem to overstate the numbers of human sacrifices based on the actual skeletal evidence we find, it's clear that there were still large numbers of human sacrifice done by the Aztec. In light of their practices, military strikes with massive destruction, sending spies out, and sacrificing non-Aztec people in public performances, the Aztec approach to rule, and others like it, have been called a theater of cruelty. The highly visible brutality of the Aztecs was a way of instilling fear in their conquered populations, keeping them from rebelling and ensuring that they kept paying taxes to the Aztec. Theaters of cruelty have been used by other cultures throughout history for similar purposes. Frequently, because we tend to focus more on European and Near Eastern history, we tend to lump other groups together on the basis of skin color, region, or cultural similarity. For example, we see all Africans as part of one group and are confused why they didn't immediately unify together against colonialism. We know that France and England, despite having people with similar looks and a lot of cultural similarities, historically did not get along, and we don't tend to question that. But when groups like the Maya and the Aztec dislike each other, we tend to get confused by that, or label them as inherently disagreeable. To us, they look alike and have similar artwork and religious stories, so we think they should be one group, or at least allies. I've heard many people tell me that Native American people were inherently violent, because neighboring tribes often rubbed each other the wrong way. But this tends to be the case everywhere. Neighboring groups, once they get close enough to each other, are inherently fighting over the same resources, and tend to at least irritate each other. In the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, and Asia, pretty much everywhere. This helps to explain why an indigenous woman appears to have assisted the Spanish when they arrived. I say appears because the woman, Malinche, was taken by Hernando Cortés as a slave shortly after the Spanish invasion of 1519, so her agency is questionable. She spoke Mayan and Aztec and may have been of Mayan ancestry. Mayan people generally welcomed the Spanish at first. In the early days after Spanish arrival, Malinche and others would have had no way of knowing that the Spanish would, in many ways, be just as much a terror as the Aztecs, both due to their colonization methods and their unintentional spread of smallpox. The Spanish invasion and the fall of the Aztec Empire is our subject for our next short lecture.